Good morning. My name is Daphne Kis. I'm the president of Royal Quant University, and I'm here to welcome you to the first of a series of interviews and interactive sessions designed to learn from a range of analysts, experts, and thought leaders who are, like us, committed to sharing and making knowledge related to our programs broadly available. In the coming sessions, we'll be drawing on a global community of professionals on a range of current topics, including technology and data, issues around AI and machine learning disruption, quantum computing and finance, and more, diversification along geographies and asset classes, sustainability and regulatory issues, and we'll be looking at compliance and long-term systematic risks. And then, as well as behavioral and tactical approaches, which will be focused on execution efficiency and psychological biases in finance and investing. For the first of these, I'm thrilled to have Amanda Pollinger with us, who is a global leader in advancing the success and impact of women in the finance and investment community. I first learned about Amanda through her nearly 20-year relationship with what was originally 100 Women in Finance, which was a group that started in New York City and has since grown into 100 Women in Finance to a global organization that is covers 32 locations and across 5 continents. I look forward to hearing more about that from Amanda, and whose mission is to empower women with a vision on ensuring that senior management and the investment community's professionals are 30% women by 2040. Leveraging this experience, Amanda most recently is now focused on growing the global female investors network that covers and serves over 2,000 female risk takers across asset classes, enabling global connectivity between peers and access to career and business opportunities. Thank you so much, Amanda, for being with us today. It's a privilege. So we're going to go through a couple of different areas. And to start, I think one of the areas, of course, given this introduction that everyone is particularly interested in, is sort of your path to leadership and how you came to all this. So a couple of questions, perhaps, that are top of mind. You had a long career as a financial industry professional, and we're very interested in knowing what took you from investing and working on investment firms to leading nonprofit organizations that are focused on ensuring gender diversity in finance. So again, welcome, and please tell us some more about this journey that you've been on.
So, and I love the fact that you said journey, because I think sometimes we think of careers as a linear path, and I think of it much more as a winding path, up mountains, down mountains, along rivers, maybe sometimes pausing, maybe sometimes going back to re-establish yourself. So as you can tell by my accent, I grew up in the UK. I grew up in Birmingham. I was the first in my family to go to university, and I went to Oxford, a college called Brasenose College at Oxford, where I read modern history. And many people would say, how does modern history equate to everything else that you've done? I think for me anyway, certainly reading modern history at Oxford, a place like Oxford, which is steeped in history, really enabled me to think through different ways of looking at the world. So many people think of history as facts. Actually, most of the discipline of what we did was to research different perspectives on the question why. Why did something happen? And I think that curiosity around why and researching different people's points of views on a particular piece of history is a large part of what's made me who I am and the way that I think about leadership and the way that I lead. But equally, every week we had to write an essay. And we'd go away and read 30 books in a week on a particular topic. And in that essay, you had to come to a decision point. Which of the various perspectives did you believe the most? Did you think were actually truthful, were actually, actually made sense? And as a leader, I think, one of the things that is really important to me, and I hope is important to the people who have been around me, is that I listen to different perspectives, but at the end of the day, I make decisions, and
Mhm.
those decisions are ultimately on me. The buck stops with me, having decided what I'm doing. And in my experience, both in my professional career, as when I've led an organization where I've had staff, but equally in nonprofit organizations where I've been a volunteer and I've led other people. My sense is that most people want a leader who is going to make decisions. Now, not necessarily, not, I mean, nobody wants to make bad decisions, right? But in my view of the world, it's a little like your career. I actually believe it's really hard to make a mistake in your career unless you make a decision that you know is fraudulent. If you go to a company that you know is fraudulent, that's a bad decision. But in general, both in leadership and in life and in our careers, it's actually about making decisions, taking that pathway, and all of that becoming part of your story.
Mhm.
So there are no in my mind, it's not making decisions. It's not coming to a point of view that actually I think is a mistake, if you like.
Mhm. Mhm.
So those were my early years in terms of where I studied. I actually The other aspect of who I am is that I've become somebody who spent a lot of time traveling globally.
Mhm.
So when I was 14 years old, I left the UK for the first time and I went to Paris on my own. I traveled from Birmingham down to London on a train, then to a ferry into France, and then on a train. And I sometimes hesitate to tell that story because parents today, and remember, this is in an era where there were no cell phones, right? And but I tell that story to and parents may not be happy to hear all of that because I think that was beginning of an adventure, and I do see travel globally, learning about new cultures, understanding different perspectives as a bit of an adventure. I was a curious person. I liked asking questions. I drove my family mad asking questions. And that was the beginning of a lifelong adventure in different cultures around the world. And so in my first job in London, when I had an opportunity at 23 years old to transfer to the US subsidiary company, I took that opportunity. Again, the next adventure.
Mhm. So tell us more about having done that work in the private sector. What was the segue for you, or the sort of imperatives that brought you to moving then to leading such an important organization during a time, certainly when in those days, as it were, when women were not especially well represented in the investment community, and what were your goals, and what inspired you to move to to the nonprofit sector and to lead women in changing their place in the community and the vision.
So I spent 7 years at a hedge fund that was run by one of my best friends from college. Another theme of my career is networks matter, relationships matter. So I was a principal at this hedge fund in New York in the early 2000s, and it was during that period of time that in my evenings I and weekends I volunteered for a number of organizations. And I was passionate about those organizations. So they included what was 100 women in hedge funds at the time, where I volunteered and became the first board chair of the organization, setting everything up from scratch before we had any staff members. I volunteered for the American Red Cross, and I was part of a women's business organization, really focused on providing readiness training to the communities in the city, but also fostering relationships between women in different businesses. And the third thing I did, my business partner at the hedge fund and I, we both attended Oxford, and so we actually ran the Oxford Alumni Association of New York out of our office, along with the hedge fund.
I'm sure you were well represented.
Yes, yes, very much so. So I was volunteering for these organizations, loved the impact that I was having. And it was around probably 6 years into being at the hedge fund that I read a book by a woman called Maggie Craddock called The Authentic Career. And I really encourage people to get hold of this book. It changed my life, and I've recommended it, given it to so many people whose life has been changed too. Maggie was herself a trader on Wall Street and came to the conclusion that as successful as she was, it wasn't what she authentically wanted to be. And so she went back to study. She did a social work degree. She did a whole bunch of education and became an executive coach,
Yeah.
very often for the people that she used to work with on Wall Street. And she wrote this book. This is the first of 3 books that she's written. They're all brilliant in their own way. And what I love about this book and why it's so inspirational is while she talks about the theoretical piece of how do you think through changes in your career, having done it herself, she has some very practical exercises that you do in order to think through, what are you prepared to give up? Because when you change careers, when you go from for profit to non-profit, there you are giving certain things up. Most importantly, money, right? And so a lot of her book talked about things like your relationship with money. Where do you get your safety and your security from, right? But having read the book and done the exercises, I realized that what I really wanted to do in life was to set up my own business and consult to organizations that had within them professionals that could be connected to a cause or an institution or a greater purpose. And so, with the blessing of my business partner, I transferred out of the hedge fund and set up Pullinger Management. And I consulted. So, the 3 organizations that I volunteered for, I approached them about working on a part-time basis as a consultant. So 100 Women in Hedge Funds, I was the first consulting executive director. The American Red Cross, I took on a leadership role there, a paid leadership role in terms of really expanding this women's business collective. And it was the time when my college at Oxford was 500 years old. And so I put together some fundraising, but more importantly, connecting alumni in America who'd gone to Brasenose together for the very first time. So my transition was initially through a business entity that consulted to a number of organizations. And frankly, what happened from there is that 100 women in hedge funds that became 100 women in finance took over my life. And so in 2013, the board asked me to become CEO on a full-time basis and to really continue the global expansion of the organization.
Great. Awesome. And certainly in its time, and continues to be incredibly critical and important work. So during that time, I mean, how do you measure impact? Could you talk to us a little bit more and what you've observed about impacts on diversity issues and related to performance and obviously before that, the kinds of barriers that brought you to do this work and how one measures impact, what the outcomes are, and what success looks like for an organization like the one you led.
So impact is a really interesting concept, and I think certainly in the world of your students, it tends to be numerical. And I'm all for measuring numerically. I think there's an important element of, of looking at data because, data tells some of the story around what's changed and what hasn't changed.
Hmm.
So, but I am somebody who also sees impact from a human perspective. And in fact, I would argue that the human impact is ultimately more important than the data. Sometimes it's harder to measure, it's harder to see because you may not realize the impact that has happened in someone's life till 10, 15, 20 years later. So it's harder than data in terms of tracking, but I think in terms of impact, it's in many ways true impact that's lasting and as I said, brings that human element into play. So I'll give you two examples. So 100 Women in Hedge Funds was first set up. And it was set up in 2001. And it's interesting. So this comes back to these two elements, right? So at the time, there were very few women in hedge funds. It was a new industry. And I was sitting in a hedge fund, the only woman at my hedge fund. And there were a lot of others around the organization that were the only one. And this sense of being the only one is challenging for a number of reasons, right? You may love, as I loved, working with all the guys, at your firm, etc. But there are moments where it's really, you really want to be able to talk to someone who's like you. And as I say all the time, it's not every day, every moment of the day. We should be hanging out with guys. This notion that we should be siloed all the time, I don't think is healthy at all. But there are moments in your life where you want to share something with somebody who just gets you.
Hmm.
And so I often said we didn't realize it, but the start of 100 Women came right after 9/11. And I think the combination of really wanting to expand the number of women in the hedge fund industry, combined with this real desire that I think in New York City people wanted around community. We didn't say it like that. We were all investors and very serious professionals. But I think that need for community came out of that period of time as I look back. And so, in terms of impact, when I think about the growth of 100 Women, 100 Women has impacted the lives of so many women. And I see women who started, who were in their early mid careers when we started 100 Women, now successful. Now, how much that has to do with 100 Women, there are lots of different elements, but I do believe if you involve yourself with an external network, if you build those relationships early in your career, you will have a you're much more likely to succeed through the various stages of your career if you've got others around you. So in terms of numbers, started with literally 100 women in hedge funds. Today, the organization, I think, boasts over 33,000 individual members, many companies in 30, I think they're now in 33 locations, 19 countries across 5 continents. So if we talk about the impact from a numbers perspective, wow, right? What started as this New York community has spread around the world. But I think as important is that many of those who I call my dearest friends are women who I met 20 something years ago at 100 Women in finance.
Yep.
And I think it's those relationships and the impact that we've had on each other's personal lives, professional lives, that actually at the end of the day is the true impact of what we do. Um, And as I said, sometimes, it takes years. And it's interesting because in some ways, when I left 100 women in 2023, at that moment, I heard so many stories of people saying, look, I've been quietly following you all these years. I want you to know you said this or you said that at an event, and I put it into practice. And, as a result, this is where I am today. So I think it's a dual, it's really impact is both data, but it's also that human element.
I totally agree with you. It's actually a good deal of what you're saying are values and ideas that we try hard at World Quant University to bring to our students, the communities of affinity, the ability to have cross-cultural exposure, and then to find support networks. We hear great stories, certainly among our alum, about networks that they've created as a result of their learning journey at the university. So we very much value that comment, and in terms of the longevity and the impact of the work. So having said all that, what do you think career readiness looks like now? I mean, we know there are areas, as you said, of network, etc. But what do you think that looks like, particularly for communities and individuals and groups that are new to the field and are entering what previously might have not been a professional area that was accessible to them and a career path?
So I think for a lot of us, and I think this is particularly women, but I hear it amongst men as well. We've been told that if you work hard and you perform, someone's going to notice you. You're going to progress in your career. And the older I get, the more I realize that's complete rubbish. It works really well when you're a student, by the way. You work hard, your performance is measured in a very objective way through a test, right? It's measured in terms of a test that you get, and you get a score on that. The problem is that when you come into the business world or any industry, any area of work, um, all of a sudden it's not just a number that defines you. It is, how do you relate to those around you? And so that's one thing that I think very often people trip up on, that they kind of say, "But I've been working so hard, and I've, and certainly, I mean, I see this all the time in Global Female Investors Network, that we have women who are outperforming their male colleagues, and this is a real number, and yet are pondering, why aren't I progressing in the firm? Why aren't I able to build my business if I'm running a fund, right? Why aren't I attracting the money? Surely it's all going to come to me. So that's one thing in terms of realizing through your career that it's not enough, right? So there are other things in terms of being career ready that you need to think about. I think the second thing is, I think there's a lot of focus on specialization today.
Mhm.
And I think there's an overemphasis on being specialized and focusing all your attention on that specialization. There is a phenomenal book called Range by David Epstein. And the subtitle is Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And David uses a number of different examples, in particular around the sports world, on why being a generalist actually makes you far more nimble, adaptable, able to see around corners, as opposed to someone who's specialized. And if you think about it, and the sports world is fascinating, because the assumption is in the sports world that in order to be the best, you need to play that particular sport from a very young age and be exclusive about training for that sport. But what David Epstein uses is the example of Roger Federer, who by the way, I danced with his father at a gala for 100 women in Geneva many years ago. So I've actually met his parents. His parents raised him to be a generalist. He
Mhm.
played football, soccer in American terms. He played a number of different sports. He was encouraged to look at the world much more broadly than just playing tennis. And what David Epstein says is that part of Roger Federer's ability to play tennis for as long as he did was because of his adaptability, his
Mhm.
ability to predict what his opponent was going to do, and that some of that came from being in different types of environments. And so I think for in terms of career readiness today, look, the world is an uncertain, changeable place, probably more now than ever before. And so the key skill is not necessarily being able to code, it's being able to adapt to a world and being in a position of what I would call being a translator. So, what's a generalist? A generalist is somebody who can connect one specialty to another, right? Who can interpret what the needs are of both groups. And so it's not about being in the weeds and understanding all the details. It's about it's about understanding conceptually how something works,
Mhm.
and then connecting all the dots and all the relationships around you. And so when we think about our careers, we've got to be in a place where we're building relationships with people who aren't like us. Goes
Mhm.
back to what I said at the beginning around really listening to different perspectives on a topic. At the end of the day, you'll be best positioned in your career if you are solving problems for people, if
Mhm.
you are able to come up with solutions. And coming up with solutions doesn't happen by being isolated, siloed. It comes from having that ability to build relationships with others who may be totally outside of your discipline.
Mhm. Well, I think certainly in what you're saying, one thing that I've lived by and I think is true across fields, which is the greatest change is the rate of change. And so your comment about adaptability surely applies to the industries in which, our students are actively engaged, and the agility and adaptability are critical to success. I guess I'd also ask, just as a side note, some of what you're describing seems to me to be well associated with leadership and how people achieve those roles and are able to see and measure, assess, impact, measure success. Do you agree? I mean, are you finding that those people are well represented among leaders, people who take that kind of, not even generalist, but that well-rounded, that ability to, as you said, see around the corner?
So I've interviewed quite a few CEOs in the financial arena around the world, mostly women, because that's obviously where my kind of the affinity group that I've been associated with. And there are a number of elements that they have in common. First of all, they are all resilient. They tell the stories of, life isn't easy, right? And it doesn't get any easier when you're in a leadership role, right? It's often lonely, right?
Mhm.
So being resilient, I think, is a really critical factor. To some extent, there are moments where, and I'm all for admitting mistakes, etc., but there are moments where things happen that are unpredictable, that go against you, where you're not in control. And I think you have to psychologically be able to get through that. And I've always said resilience is an interesting one. I mean, that's a topic for a whole hour of itself, right?
Great.
Where does it come from? My view is it is partly where you came from. I do think that the family system, whether it was good or bad, teaches you resilience one way or another. But it also can be learned. I mean, it is a muscle that you can exercise and really develop. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that every single female CEO in the finance arena that I've met every single one of them had international experience. Every single one of them got out of the country in which they were born, at least for a period of time. And I think there are two things that are critical there. One is, particularly for women, um, being able to demonstrate that you're prepared to take calculated risks is critical. It's absolutely critical. Otherwise, women get left out of opportunities. So, me taking that assignment when I was 23, by the way, all of this is easier to do when you're younger. I'm not saying you can't do it when you're older, but when you're younger and you don't have the house, the kids, the spouse, all the things that come along with life, much easier to pick up and go to another country. But from a professional perspective, not only does it give you international experience and that, again, learning how to adapt in a culture that's not your own, learning how to be in a conversation with people who speak a different language, who have come up through a very different culture. But also it's that demonstration of taking that calculated risk. And that is absolutely critical. It goes back to what I said before, that I think there are no bad decisions that you make, apart from something that you do that is illegal or fraudulent, obviously. But, taking that calculated risk adds to not only other people's perception of you, but it adds to your knowledge that you can do it, right? You can find yourself in a tough place and get through it. And so those are two things. The third thing, which I always kind of half hesitate, because it's not something that's necessarily in our control, but I can tell you that every senior leader who's a woman in our industry that I have met, every single one of them said, I had a father who told me I could be whatever I wanted to be.
Wow.
And it speaks to the fact that we need, we cannot avoid the role of men in all of this, right? It is really critical. We need men to be saying to their daughters, you can be whatever you want to be, and whatever you decide, I'm with you, right? And that's not to minimize the role of mothers, but I do think there is a very particular relationship between a father and his daughter. And it's a tough one to say, because not everybody has the best father in the world. Not everyone has, not all fathers are responsible or around, but certainly I think it's something that I say to men a lot, is you really can influence the rest of a woman's life, and by really being supportive and giving her those options
Right.
and letting her believe in herself.
Right. I mean, I think you're right, and certainly there are circumstances that where people may not have the level of someone who's such a strong advocate. But it does speak more generally to the idea of finding mentors and people who can not only guide you in the specifics, regardless of the industry, but also, so importantly, believe in you and nurture you in a way that gives you the confidence. And as you said, in the finance industry, that's been critical, and is, I'm sure you'll find it in other industries in which women are probably underrepresented, whether it's a father or a mentor or someone who again, apart from the skills, gives you the boost that you need to have faith in yourself and to see yourself outside yourself, in a sense, to advocate. So let's segue a little bit then to the sort of the question of the future and work and skills, and as we just said, these areas, finance, data science, tech, they're all converging in a way more than ever. And what kinds of skills do you think are essential for the next generation of finance leaders? We spoke to some of the most general skills that really, many of which apply across industries, but specifically in finance and in the investment community, what are some of the characteristics you think are key?
So it's interesting. I was having a conversation the other day with a guy who's been in the industry a long time, and we were saying how much in some ways how much easier the world used to be, in many, many ways, in terms of the investment function in particular. But I think in every way, I think I mean, I have to go back to that to range in my comments, because I think there is this thinking that, okay, well, if I know all the details of what is the latest AI, algorithm in order to create this environment, or if I can create a model that's going to give me the success, the challenge becomes, and it goes back to what I said about even with impact, the challenge is that the world is changing at such a high pace that actually it's not enough to become a specialist in a certain area. And one of the interesting things about the group that I created last year, a Global Female Investors Network, is so you've got women who are brilliant investors. They are specialized in a particular area, but increasingly, in order to inform accurately their own models, their own perception of where they should be investing, they have to increasingly talk to people who are in very different arenas to
Mhm.
understand okay, I never thought about this as being an input to my model, for example, but
Mhm.
actually all of a sudden it is. And obviously, right now, what's going on in terms of tariffs is disrupting. So tariffs are a policy area. They're not in the finance world, right? But the tariffs themselves and the implications, but more importantly, what's happening geopolitically is now having as much impact as what used to be the traditional inputs of the oil price going up and down, get up or down, and inflation and other things. So I think it's complex, right? And I think the way through is to build relationships and build networks with people who are doing things that are different from you, so you can understand where their area is intersecting with your area, right?
Mhm.
Of course, AI, I mean, AI, so much talk about AI, learning what's helpful in terms of the tools of AI. So this is continuous learning. I mean, I just did a couple of courses recently on AI for membership organizations, right? To really understand what are the tools that are out there. But I understand. So I need the technical. I've got a lot of the relationship stuff. I need to understand what's technically possible, right? So it is this combination. I think the future is about a combination of how does the technological interact with all of the human elements, the geopolitical elements that are constantly changing. So you've got this ever-changing world, and it's complicated, right? So my advice would be, stay curious, keep learning, talk to everybody, um, uh, you know, keep doing courses. Um, yes, get the specialized training, but also don't underestimate what used to be called soft skills, which I believe are essential skills. And I'll give you an example. Um, a subset of our group are women who own their own fund. These are women who are brilliant. They've got a track record. They are performing. Their frustration and where they're coming to me is to say, why can't we raise money? Why is no one investing in us? To which I'll say, are you visible? Have you set up your company in a way that it's going to be attractive to someone who's investing? Are you using the right language? Are you out there being visible? Are you talking? on TV or at a conference or whatever, so that the people you want to invest in you actually know who you are. And so it's really funny. I'm dealing with brilliant women who are phenomenal investors who've never learned about what I now call essential skills. And I think we need both. We need the technical and the specialized, but we also need those general skills. And that's kind of the human element here that
Right.
AI is never going to take away.
Right. I like my word of choice is durable, because those are the kinds of skills that, again, to earlier points about adaptability and change and the rate of change and so on, are the kinds of skills that evolves, but fundamentally it's critical to certainly to leadership, to success, to opportunity, and all that. So you've given bunch of great advice. I mean, it sounds like throughout your career you've used networks, you've used the connections, you've used colleagues, and the collaboration that comes with that. How do you think that technology is changing the opportunities these days for groups that are underrepresented in finance, particularly in quantitative roles?
So what I would say is it's really interesting because it's all, I mean, about what I'm about to say sounds like a contradiction. On the one hand, there is more access to available tools that are free or certainly relatively cheap. So there's more access to all of that technology than when I was growing up. I mean,
Mhm.
I didn't have a laptop growing up, right? There was no internet. There was, so the access in theory is much greater. The challenge is that there are still, if you come from an environment where you don't necessarily have all of the fundamental ability, if you don't have that smartphone, if you don't have access to the internet, if you don't have the basics, right, you're prohibited from taking advantage of those pieces. But equally, if you're not if you're not surrounded by people who can direct you in terms of where to go and where the best use of your time is, and again, if you're generally with underrepresented communities, that's the case. You don't have a natural group of people around you who are saying, hey, have you tried this, have you seen this, have you accessed that, right, in an informal environment. And so it goes back to why it's really critical to be involved with networks, to find your people in this environment.
Mhm.
And I think everybody can do that. Unless you're, I mean, very, very few people on earth are now living in an environment where they don't have some kind of access to the outside world. But I think there is this kind of dichotomy of there's so much out there that is available, but it's the how do you know where how to access and what's important to access, that's really critical. And it does come back to networks. So for example, I belong to a wonderful network called Extraordinary Women on Boards,
Mhm.
and every Sunday they send out an email that is priceless stuff on all sorts of trends. Which are the articles you should be reading with the mindset of being on a board? What is the latest on AI? Hey, try this out. So a lot of my experimenting has come from that direction
Mhm.
of where do I go for my particular area, where do I go? And so getting involved with lots of different networks where you're going to get that information fed to you. So again, a lot more accessible, a lot cheaper, a lot more available. But it's about using your time wisely to go after the best resources that are out there. And for that, you need a network. You can't be isolated.
Agreed. So of course, many of our students, like as we've discussed, are and like your experience, are the first in their families to pursue, graduate level educations, etc. You've shared your experience. What advice do you have for some of our students, perhaps, sort of in terms of owning their path, which is very specific in a certain sense, and yet so empowering.
So I believe very strongly that those to whom much is given, much is required. Um, I grew up as the first in my family to go to university. I owe my decision on going to Oxford to Margaret Thatcher, who, like me, was the first in her family to go to university. She went to a local school. She didn't go to a fancy girls' school. She went to Oxford. As a teenage girl, she
Hmm.
was visible to me. So she was visible. Um, and less around her becoming prime minister, although obviously becoming the first female prime minister was a big deal, but it was much more around the fact that she was like me. Um,
Hmm.
and actually, I really regret, going back to something we said earlier, I really regret never writing to her and telling her my story.
Hmm.
Um, and because I do owe her a lot. And so, what I would say to those individuals, so two things. One is pay it forward, right? Pay it forward. Offer to be visible. Go back to the schools, universities where you were the first in your family. Talk to others who are going to be in that boat, and reassure them it's possible, right? And for
Hmm.
most of us, if we can see that something is possible for someone like us, all of a sudden the pathway becomes much more plausible and much more much more authentic, quite
Hmm.
frankly.
Hmm.
And so first is that responsibility to pay it forward. So I hope hopefully I've taken that responsibility very seriously, and and encouraged young women to go for it, to tread that path, which isn't easy all the time. But the second piece is, very often, as somebody who's a pioneer, and who is the first in your family to do it, sometimes you can feel in those moments where you're making decisions and there's nobody in your family you can talk to. um, and there's nobody in your kind of natural friendship group that you can talk to because you're the first, right? You're different from all of those. um, Sometimes you can have imposter syndrome, right? There are moments where it's like, oh my, I really, am I kidding myself that I can do this and that and the other? And it's in those moments that having your small group of friends, advisors, whatever you want to talk, find your people, find the people where you can mutually encourage each other.
Hmm.
I always tell a story that, like everybody else, I'm terrible at negotiating my salary, and hate it, hate it. Maybe everybody hates it, but I remember I was at a .com before I joined the hedge fund. I was at a .com, and it was coming up for negotiation time. And there were three women in the office. There weren't many women, but the three of us got together and we deliberately practiced on each other what we were going to say and what attack, and was this reasonable and was that reasonable, and we had this whole conversation. And while the tactical is important, actually what ended up being the best part of it was that whatever happened in those negotiations, we knew we could come back to a group that was going to say, it's fine, you did your best, or well done, you, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And certainly, again, men are like this too, but I found women in particular, most women are terrible at promoting themselves. but they are fantastic at promoting their girlfriends, right? Their other female colleagues. So
Okay.
use that to find your people, whether you're male or female, find your people who are going to support you in those imposter syndrome moments. But the
Right.
most critical thing is realize that you've been given a real opportunity, you've taken it, pay it forward so that we see that, so that the next generation of young people can see that it's possible.
Possible. Yep. Um, you've emphasized the sort of power, just to re-emphasize that um, how as our community are building networks virtually, is there any sort of counsel or ideas that you have about that? As you know, where our students are distributed all over the world. Some do, some don't have the opportunity for broader travel, etc., and might really rely on sort of virtual versions of many of the things that were talked about. And any additional advice you have to give them as they build these networks?
So look, COVID changed so much for all of us in terms of realizing that we can use technology like this. We can be in different parts of the world and communicate. And one of the really fascinating things actually in this past year for Global Female Investors Network is that I imagined that a group of people round a real table would be far more open around challenges and opportunities than a Zoom call. Actually, not the case. What's interesting about having people open up is number one, it's a small group. Number two, these are people like you. So there's this kind of safe environment that's being created. So from that perspective, I would say, have as many conversations as you possibly can with people around the world, right? So you can learn a lot. Having said all that, and I am definitely an in-person person. I think while you may not have tons of opportunity to travel. When you do travel, even if you're traveling on holiday, on vacation, you know, find people there. I've done it numerous times. So this past Christmas, New Year, my husband and I flew to Malaysia on holiday, came back through Singapore. I decided, I'd take a day and reach out to whoever was around, meet up in person, right? You know, and so it's amazing what you can figure out once you have these conversations around where are you traveling to? Hey, do you want to meet up halfway somewhere? In person, definitely there's something that happens when we see each other in person that is very unique. But really, you know, the world is your oyster, and so you do what you have to do. If you can't find people locally, then you reach out. And I'll tell you one story, one thing that I discovered during COVID and after Black Lives Matter and George Floyd um, tragedy, one of the things that I wanted to personally do was to figure out how could I have an impact on, and in my case, I wanted to make an impact for women, for Black women who were in the finance industry. And so using LinkedIn, which by the way, I'm a huge advocate of LinkedIn. It's a phenomenal way. I've built Global Female Investors Network through LinkedIn.
Uh-huh.
We now have over 2,000 people from nothing, right? So I searched for and I connected. I didn't just connect with Black women who were in the finance industry. I asked every single one of them for a half-hour Zoom conversation. What that did was first of all, what I realized was why the heck didn't I know these women before, right? So there's something about being very deliberate in networking. But secondly, I realized there were far more than I thought there were. So, we all talk about how few women there are. Well, let's change that narrative to say, here are the women who are in this industry, who are in these technology roles. I mean, the technology area is exactly the same as finance, right? And those specialized, particularly senior roles, there are very few women. Um, and so it changed my perception in terms of how many were actually out there. And now all of a sudden it's not, oh, it's just me. Now it's actually there's more than just one of me. So I think being deliberate in terms of using a LinkedIn and then finding opportunities if you can to be in person is really valuable.
So we're kind of running out of time, but I guess I have one last question. One of the things I think is we talk about these networks and the unparalleled access we have to information is trust and people who you trust. It's easy to sort of listen to voices that might not be as useful or effective for you, but how do you discriminate? So we rely on people like you to tell us sort of who are you listening to. So to finish up, I'd love to hear like who are some of the global influencers or thinkers whose work you think is currently worth following. You've given us a couple of book recommendations, which are awesome, and we will definitely check them out and make some connections to those. But tell us about people you turn to now and you look at who you think are the voices that we should be listening to. Certainly, particularly in the world of finance and investing, but overall would be great to hear.
So do you know, I I'm someone who it's really interesting because this of all the questions you've asked is the hardest for me to answer because I don't the only person who I really ever cite as somebody who's influenced me is Margaret Thatcher, right? That was early in my life. And people say, well, if you had a mentor, if you had this and that and the other person, it's really hard for me. I am somebody who thinks very much around the collective and that everybody I meet is going to be additive to who I am. So I'm afraid I really can't answer your question in terms of a human being or a number of human beings who I am following. I tend to follow, I tend to follow collective. So as I said, I'm part of these various organizations. I'm following the advice they're giving me, right? I've just, extraordinary women on boards or, the American Society of Association executives who are looking at membership organizations. So I tend to look at these things much more collectively as opposed to following a person.
That's great.
That's really my answer to it
That's
is
great.
be open. You never know. You can meet someone in a grocery store who is actually going to give you wisdom. It's about being curious and having your mind open to that.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying and how consistent it is with your career path and the give and take that comes with all of that. So we've run out of time. I think we could go on for hours, but I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time, Amanda, to talk to our community, our global community of learners. And we look forward to the ongoing series, which is evolving. It's a work in progress, and on drawing from a broad global community as well as from your network, which is, as we know, heavily populated with people who are experts, as you said, investment expertise, deep knowledge, analytic knowledge, etc. And look forward to an exciting series. And also, we'll certainly be looking to our community for ideas and what people want to hear, what they want to learn more from, people they want to learn from, communities whose voices they want to hear. So again, thank you so, so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Be well. Bye-bye.